Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy, but also to talk about what's happening with oil prices. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that Russia recently introduced an export ban on gasoline, diesel and other refined products. And the reason that it did that is because Russia, bizarrely, has been experiencing shortages in its home market. Now, Russia has one of the biggest reserves of oil in the world, and previously it was one of the biggest exporters. But for various reasons, 45% of its refining capabilities are currently offline, so they're not using almost half of their 44 mega-refineries. And that's led to shortages at a key time in the Russian economy, because right now in Russia is harvest time. Russia has a huge amount of farmland and it produces massive amounts of crops. And all of the farmers currently need fuel to be able to work all of their equipment to pull in all of that harvest. If they don't get it, there is a risk that those harvests go to waste, and that could cause problems for Russia for two reasons. Firstly, it wouldn't have enough food to feed its own people, and secondly, it exports a lot of those products and makes a lot of money from all of that income. So the key focus right now for President Putin is to make sure that the farmers and Russian businesses have enough fuel, and so he's banned the export of all products. Now, the impact of that has been twofold. Firstly, that's a huge negative from Russia's point of view because they've lost a massive amount of income. We'll have a look later in the video just how much income they're losing, but it is astronomical. But secondly, there's also a knock-on impact to the global economy. Because Russia is one of the exporters of oil, if we see a reduction in the amount of oil that's being exported, then that has a knock-on impact to the price. Now, over the course of the last few weeks, I've been talking about the price of oil because it's been going up. Now, that is counterintuitive because at the moment, we've got a global slowdown, and the oil markets are the perfect market in terms of supply and demand. If there is a reduction in demand that you would associate with a global slowdown, you would have expected the price of oil to fall. And that actually is what we saw at the back end of 2022 and the first half of 2023. However, the global market for oil is also influenced by supply. And OPEC Plus, which is a consortium of countries that are some of the largest exporters, came together around a year ago and decided that they didn't like what was happening with the price of oil, and therefore they were going to reduce their supplies to get prices to go back up. And that's exactly what we've seen over the course of the last 2 or 3 months. And prices right now are currently at levels that we haven't seen for a very long period of time. And the announcement that Russia has now banned the export of all refined products has led to a further increase in oil prices. And this is putting further pressure onto the global economy at a time when a lot of countries are teetering on the brink of recession. So in today's video, I'll have a detailed look at what's going on with oil prices and talk about what the implications of the current price increases are for the global economy. We'll also have a look at what's been going on with Russian oil prices, because the oil price cap of $60 that was brought in back in December isn't really having a massive impact right now because Russia is able to export oil using other methods. So we'll have a look at where the price is for that and talk about what the issues are. We'll then have a look at what's happening with the Russian ruble because that's been weakening severely over the course of the last 12 months. Now, Russia have been increasing its interest rates. Officially, they've been doing that to try to tackle high inflation. But there isn't really high inflation in Russia right now, certainly not to justify the level of increases in interest rates that we've seen. And there is a direct link between what's happening with interest rates and what should be happening with the value of your currency. So we'll have a look at where the Russian ruble is and what the impact of that's going to be on the Russian economy. We'll then talk about what's happening with US oil supplies. The US actually has large storage areas where it holds huge volumes of oil, but those storage areas have started to be depleted over the course of the last few months because when prices are high, there is pressure to sell that oil into the market. So we'll have a look at that situation. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think is likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months and what the impact will be for the global economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much for all the great messages of support that I've received recently, particularly about the Czech shirts. I'm keeping those coming. And if you'd like to see more shirts like this and more videos that are not being posted on YouTube, as well as avoiding the annoying adverts that you get repeatedly on YouTube, then please check out my Patreon channel. But if you don't like Patreon and you'd like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to buy me a coffee, as well as YouTube's super thanks and membership scheme. This chart shows the movement in the price of a barrel of Brent crude oil over the course of the last 12 months. And as you can see, the current price at the time of making this video was above $96 per barrel. And actually, earlier in the day, prices had gone above $97, which is the highest that's been seen at any point in the last year. And if we look at the shape of this chart, you can see that 12 months ago, a barrel of Brent crude was trading for around $85. However, by the start of November, prices had got up to above $95. But then over the course of the next 8 months, prices came down, and by the end of June, a barrel of Brent was trading for around $72. Now, as we've talked about a lot on the channel, over that period, the global economy saw a significant downturn. We've seen a real slowdown as a result partly of the knock-on impact of the slowdown in China, and also many other economies struggling with high levels of inflation and reduced GDP. Now, in normal circumstances, the oil market can be regarded as a perfect market. Supply and demand meet to give you the price. And the fall in the price between November and June is a good representation of what was going on in the global economy. However, if you look at what's been happening over the course of the last few months, there has been a significant increase in the price of oil, which would theoretically indicate that the global economy has picked up rapidly. However, we now have a complete disconnect between what's happening in the global economy and what's happening with the price of oil as a direct result of the actions of OPEC+, which we'll come on to talk about later in the video. If we now expand the scale of this chart to the last 5 years, you can see that the price of a barrel of oil has only been at the current level for a brief period immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when we had an exceptional market. Russia at that point was supplying large quantities of oil directly to Europe, but as a direct result of the sanctions, all of those countries stopped buying Russian oil, and there was a scramble in the markets to try to find alternative suppliers. And this led to a huge increase in the price. But if we look at the 3-year period prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you can see that prices were significantly lower than they are today. And if we expand the chart out to the last 25 years, you can see that prior to 2022, there have only been 2 periods when prices have been close to $100 per barrel. The first of those was in 2008, when the global markets were on fire. That was a period of rapid growth, which unfortunately was just before the global financial crisis. So this was a time when everybody thought the global economy was doing really well, but unfortunately there was a lot of smoke and mirrors, a lot of institutions were built on sand, and as we know from our history lessons, a lot of the financial markets became insolvent, and many banks and financial institutions had to be bailed out. And then the only other time that the price of oil has been this high was the period between 2011 and 2014, when the global economy was doing very well. This was the bounce back period that came on following the recession caused by the global financial crisis. And the reason I wanted to share this chart with you is that usually when the price of oil is rising rapidly, it represents a period of rapid growth for the global economy, because demand is going up and therefore prices go up. But the problem we have right now is that we've got rapidly rising prices for oil at a time when the global economy is in slowdown, and that represents really bad news, because the price of oil feeds through into everything. We use oil for transport, for fuel, and as a raw material for lots of different industries. So when the price of oil rises, it increased costs for everybody, and the last thing that we need right now is further increases in costs, because over the course of the last 18 months, many countries have been experiencing high levels of inflation. Most economies are still trying to bring that inflation back down by raising interest rates. So the last thing that everybody needs right now is a further increase in oil prices. This chart shows the movement in the price of Russian oil over the course of the last 12 months. Now, as I'm sure you'll be aware, on the 5th of December, the West introduced an oil price cap of $60 per barrel for all Russian oil. And the way that this price cap was to operate was that whenever Russia needed to use ships or insurance that was provided by the West, the companies involved would require to see documentation proving that Russia had sold its oil at no higher than $60 per barrel. and Russia was obliged to comply with those demands because it simply didn't have enough tankers to be able to distribute its own oil. And you can see from the shape of this chart the direct impact that price cap had. Prior to its introduction, Russia was selling oil above $80 per barrel. However, immediately following the cap being brought in, the price of Russian oil fell below $60 and remained at that level all the way through until July. However, since that period, the price of an average barrel of Russian oil has risen significantly and is now sitting at above $83. And the reasons for that are threefold. Firstly, the general price of oil has risen in the international markets. And although Russia is still selling at a discount, that discount is around $15 or $20 per barrel. So that's one of the reasons that's pushed up the price of Russian oil. The second factor is that Russia is selling more oil via pipelines to China. And obviously, when it's delivering the oil directly, the West has no influence on those deals. And thirdly, Russia has managed to find other ways of transporting the oil that doesn't involve the use of Western ships. So at face value, this looks like good news from Russia's perspective. However, there are some negatives. Firstly, there is the ban that's just been introduced by the Russian authorities on the export of all refined products. And secondly, there's the issue with regards to the shutdown of around 45% of capacity for Russian refineries. This chart shows the breakdown of the income received by Russia for the sale of all of its fossil fuels. And the key area that I want to focus in on in this chart is the red section in the middle, which represents the sale of refined oil products. Now, as you can see from the right-hand side of this chart, the sale of refined oil products actually represents the largest portion of Russia's income, around 250 million euros or $275 million per day, which on an annualized basis equates to more than $100 billion. And the reason that I wanted to highlight this is that despite the fact that oil prices are going up, Russia has now introduced an outright ban on the export of all of these products as a direct result of shortages in their home market. And as it stands at the moment, we don't know when that ban is going to be lifted. But every single day that it remains in place, Russia is losing around $275 million of income, which is obviously bad news in itself. But there are also some serious knock-on implications of this because the Russian oil industry is dependent upon volume. When you're pulling around 10 million barrels of oil out of the ground every single day, you need to send it somewhere. Russia doesn't have anywhere to store that quantity of oil. So it has the choice either of loading it onto ships or pipelines for export or delivering it to its own 44 refineries to pass through the system and make it into gasoline and diesel and other products. Now, currently around 45% of Russia's refineries are in shutdown. So that's almost half the amount of oil that Russia can process through its own systems. And that's putting further pressure onto the crude oil exports because if the oil isn't being sent to the refineries, it needs to be loaded onto ships or pipelines. And the problem that Russia has is that it doesn't have its own shipping fleet to be able to send that. So even though it's been managing to avoid using the West for shipping, the longer that this ban goes on, the more likely it is that Russia will have to use those ships because it needs to keep that capacity moving and therefore will be subject to the price cap. However, if it decides it doesn't want to use the West, then the other option it has is to close down its production. And that could cause it some serious problems because, as you'll know, Russia has cut its ties with most of the oil majors. Companies like BP, ExxonMobil and Shell all exited Russia following their invasion of Ukraine. They stated that they no longer wanted to deal with them. And the problem that Russia has is that they firstly lost the expertise that those companies bring, but also the technology. And we're going into the critical winter period now, and a lot of Russia's oil business is in areas that get extremely cold, and so there can be real production problems. And if Russia decides to strangle the amount of oil that's coming out of the ground, it may find it very difficult to be able to fire that production back up again in the future, and therefore it could have long-lasting implications on the Russian oil business and also the Russian economy. This chart shows the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble over the course of the last 12 months. And what this shows is that there has been a continued and consistent decline in the value of the ruble. This time last year, $1 US was trading for around 55 rubles. Today, it's closer to 97. And the contrast between the value of the US dollar and the Russian ruble is stark. Generally speaking, the value of the US dollar is aligned to what's happening with oil prices. When oil prices go up, it generally results in a strengthening of the dollar. And that's exactly what we've seen over the course of the last few months. Now, unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, the ruble is not linked to what's happening with oil prices. And this is much to the frustration of President Putin. Immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, President Putin came out and stated that all unfriendly nations had to pay for natural gas imports using Russian rubles. And the reason that he was doing that was to try to establish the ruble as a currency that was linked to fossil fuels in the same way as the dollar is often referred to as the petrodollar. However, that strategy did not prove to be successful, and actually most of those unfriendly nations have now severed all of their relationships with Russia, so they're no longer buying any natural gas or oil from Russia. And what you can see from this chart is that despite the fact that oil prices have risen significantly in the last 3 months, the value of the ruble has fallen. And this represents an ongoing problem for the Russian economy, because one of the reasons why interest rates were increased dramatically over the course of the last few months was to try to save the value of the ruble. At one point recently, the value of the ruble fell below 100 to $1, and that proved to be a breaking point from President Putin's point of view, who instructed the Russian central bank to do something about it. They organised an emergency meeting and hiked rates to try to bring the value back down. Now, that increase in interest rates did have the desired effect, but unfortunately, it only lasted for a very short period of time. And over the course of the last couple of weeks, we've started to see more pressure being applied against the ruble, and there is a possibility that it could get back up to that 100 level. And if it does, then it's likely that we could see more interest rate rises. So all of this is very interesting from a currency point of view, but what's more damaging is what's happening in the Russian economy, because those increases in interest rates are resulting in increases for the cost of borrowings for companies and consumers, and that's likely to result in a reduction in investment and spending at a time when the Russian economy is desperate for both of those things to be increased. So the reason that I wanted to share this chart with you is that the ongoing weakness of the Russian ruble is having a negative impact on the Russian economy. This chart shows the volume of oil stored at the US storage facility in Cushing, dating back to 2013. And the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is measured in millions of barrels of oil and goes from 0 at the bottom to 60 million at the top. Now, Cushing is strategically located to pull in barrels from top US shale fields and Canada, while its hundreds of tanks are tied to pipelines that supply US mid-continent and southern refineries and funnel oil to Gulf Coast export ports. Since hitting a 2-year high in June of over 43 million barrels, Cushing's levels have tumbled to just under 23 million barrels, which is the lowest since July 2022. And analysts are forecasting that a further 1 million barrels of oil per week will be drawn out of the facility. And the problem at Cushing is that 20 million barrels of oil is considered to be the absolute minimum. Water and sediment often settle at the base of storage tanks, making the crude oil at the bottom unable to meet quality standards for refiners and exporters. Some tanks have outlets at the bottom that can be used to empty oil and sludge completely, while others do not, and therefore the oil at the base cannot be removed completely. And at lower levels, it becomes more expensive for companies to get the remaining crude out of the tanks. The roof of the storage tanks also floats on the oil, preventing vapours from building up or escaping into the atmosphere. However, when the legs of these roofs touch the base, it creates a gap between the oil and the roof, causing combustible vapours to form. Strong refining demand, rising crude exports and futures prices have been weaker than spot prices, which have drained Cushing's tank farms. High interest rates have also pushed up the cost for storing oil, encouraging outflows. In 2014, the last time Cushing levels fell below 20 million barrels, any major consequences were avoided, as stocks quickly rebuilt due to prices rising at the hub. Also, the USA was not a crude oil exporter at that point due to a 40-year export ban, which was subsequently lifted in 2015. Now, with high oil export demand, market participants are worried that draws at Cushing will continue. The world is currently hungry for crude oil, and any incremental production is likely to get exported rather than stored. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video really to give you an update as to what's happening with regards to the Russian fuel ban. And as it stands right now, that ban is still in force and will be for the foreseeable future. And every single day that Russia applies this ban, it's losing hundreds of millions of dollars of export income. As we saw earlier in the video, it equates to around $275 million per day, which would be more than $100 billion if Russia keeps this ban in place for a whole year. Now, that's probably unlikely, But what is likely is that it's going to stay in place while Russia is focusing on its harvest. And that potentially could be to the end of October or even the end of November, depending on whether Russia can sort its supplies out. And one of the main drivers for the shortages that have been experienced in the Russian market over the course of the last month or so has been the fact that they've got 45% of their refineries that are not working at the moment. That's almost half of the 44 refineries. Now, this is a major problem for Russia for a couple of reasons. Firstly, obviously, there's the shortages in the home market. Secondly, they're losing all of this export income. But thirdly, those refineries need to keep operating to stay efficient. The way the oil industry is structured, it relies upon constant flow. When you take oil out of the ground, you need to find somewhere to put it. And in Russia's case, they simply don't have any storage facilities. So when they take out crude oil, they are either putting it onto ships to export it, or they're putting it through their refinery process, producing gasoline, diesel, and other products, and then exporting and using those products. The fact that they've got half of their refineries currently in standby mode means that they can't pass the crude oil that's coming out of the ground into those refineries, and therefore they're having to export more crude oil to keep the flow moving on the oil rigs. So the problem that Russia is having right now is it's having to find more buyers for that crude oil to keep the flows coming. If they can't do that, if they can't increase the sale of crude oil, then that potentially means that they will have to cut back on their production to choke the flow that's coming out of the ground. And that could cause them major problems in the long term. As we've discussed before on the channel, Russia has cut its ties with most of the oil majors. And these companies are the ones that have the expertise and the technology to be able to handle problems. And that's left the Russian oil industry on its own and isolated. And if it encounters problems, particularly through the winter period that we're going into over the course of the next few months, they could get into the situation where they simply can't get enough oil out of the ground to meet all of the demand. So there's a real tipping point here, and it's a fine balance that Russia is running. But if we take a step back and look at what the implications of the current situation are for the Russian economy, it's all bad news. The fact that there are shortages happening in the Russian market right now, and also that farmers are being prioritised, means that currently Russian industries may not be able to get enough fuel to operate at maximum capacity. So that means that they'll be reducing their output and therefore reducing their earnings and income at a time when Russia needs all of these companies to be operating full steam ahead. But in addition to the shortages, the price increases that have been felt in the wholesale markets in Russia, because the retail markets are capped, means that the input prices are going up for those companies, which will reduce their profits. So that's a double whammy from their point of view. They potentially got reduced output and increased costs at the same time. So obviously that represents bad news internally for Russia, but there is also external bad news, because the ban on the export of fuel products means that Russia is no longer earning the money from those sales. So this is really a nightmare situation for the Russian economy. But if we take a step back and look at what the impact of all of this is on the global economy, it's also bad news, predominantly because of what's been happening with oil supply. Over the course of the last 12 months, we have seen a slowdown in the global economy. And what should be happening at times of global slowdown is that there's a reduction in demand for oil. Therefore, the price of oil comes down to match the global slowdown. It should make everything more affordable, reduce the cost base for everybody at a time when industry is slowing down. But because OPEC Plus doesn't like the concept of oil prices falling, they're trying to preserve the value of their valuable assets. They've been cutting supply. And of course, in economics, supply and demand both have an impact on price. So even though we've seen a reduction in demand, which should bring down the price of oil, because the supply of oil has been reduced even further, that means that prices have actually been going up. So we've got a nightmare scenario for the global economy of a global slowdown, so pressure on companies, reduction in income, reduction in profits, and at the same time, an increase in costs. And the cost of oil feeds through into virtually everything. It's used predominantly in transport, but it's also used to create energy, and it's also used as a raw material in lots of different industries. So when the price of oil goes up, it increases costs across the board, and that's going to cause even more problems in the global economy and potentially accelerate the declines that are happening right now, particularly for countries that are net importers of oil, because they have no choice. They just have to pay the market price. Demand, generally speaking, is always high for oil. It's very difficult to be able to switch it out for anything else. So if the price goes up, you have to bite the bullet and keep paying. But it will impact on profits, which then potentially means that companies can hire less people, pay less money, and therefore could push a lot of countries that are currently teetering on the brink of recession over the edge. So the overall summary of today's video is that the problems that are being experienced in the Russian economy right now are obviously bad news for Russia. Those problems will get worse by the ban that's been introduced on the export of fuel, because Russia's no longer receiving that income. But unfortunately for the global economy, this is also bad news, predominantly because of what's been happening with OPEC+. We're in the midst of a global slowdown right now. There are still problems with regards to inflation in a lot of countries. Even though it's been coming down, it's still above the target level in most countries. We've got high rates of interest that have been applied that are still feeding through into those economies. And an increase in the cost of oil is going to represent further bad news for both countries, companies, and the global economy. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, particularly on the price of oil. And one of the key questions at the moment is whether or not it will hit that magical $100 per barrel. It isn't something that anybody wants right now, apart from all of the members of OPEC+, who are sitting counting the cash and rubbing their hands every time oil prices go up. But for the rest of us who are just having to buy oil and pay those costs, it represents bad news. And if it does get to $100 per barrel, as we saw from the data earlier in the video, we've only seen that on a few occasions over the course of the last 25 years. And most of those occasions have coincided with boom times for the global economy, not down times for the global economy. So these rising oil prices could make things a lot worse. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.